Welcome to All About Art. My name is Alexandra, and I'm an art historian, curator, and writer. Within this podcast, topics relating to art history, cultural policy, the art sector, as well as a large range of other art-related topics will be covered. Conducting critical discussions, having entertaining exchanges, or just enjoying some relaxing chats, All About Art is where you'll find it all. Join me in exploring and developing cultural discourse. Welcome to another episode of All About Art. In this episode, I sat down with Valeria Szabó Facchin, founder of Studio Expanded, a new artist management agency redefining the art ecosystem. I speak to Valeria about her previous professional experiences, notably as founding director of the Nicoletta Fiorucci Foundation, and how this impacts how she approaches business now. We delve into what it means to be an artist manager, from choosing the artists that she works with to liaising with partners and developing sustainable strategies for the creatives on her roster. We speak about the importance of understanding everything about an artist's career and practice when working with them, to thinking about potential collaborations and opportunities for them, and so much more. Thank you, Valeria, for coming on the podcast. Before we dive into the episode, I want to take a minute of your time to mention that All About Art is on Patreon. We are mostly volunteer-led, but in order to cover running costs and other expenses, we make it possible for our lovely listeners to support us, ranging from £1 a month to the price of an oat latte a month, or on the higher end, the price of a Sunday brunch per month, depending on the tier you want to choose. If every person who listens to the podcast signed up for the £1 tier on our Patreon, we would be able to sustain the podcast while also having scope to produce episodes more frequently and expand our activities in demystifying the professional arts sector. So, if you want to receive early access to episodes and behind-the-scenes content, maybe you want to get some merch, or if you just love what we do and want to support us, I would be thrilled if you considered signing up. The link to the Patreon is in the show notes. And now, on to the interview. Also, thank you to our sponsors at Synergy Associates, the art world tech gurus, for supporting this episode's production at their clubhouse on Pall Mall. You can find more about Synergy and their facilities in the show notes. All right, welcome to the podcast, Valeria.
Thank you so much for having me, Alexandra. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. I would love for you to tell listeners about your background. I kind of just want to start off by setting a good base, getting to know you. Can you tell me more about what you studied and how you developed your career, as you have such extensive experience in the cultural sector, notably your previous role as the founding director of the Nicoletta Fiorucci Foundation, which I'd love to hear more about.
Yeah, sure. It's been not an easy path, I would say, into the arts. I've always been into arts since I was a kid. I think for me, it was my sort of religion, always, trying to find beauty in things. And since I was a little kid, I was always challenging, for example, my upbringing, fact that I was Catholic. And so I remember quoting, for example, Nietzsche to my priest. And in a way, for me, it was very much that art is beauty. And I've always been drawn to the idea of Dostoevsky saying that art will save the world.
I'm sorry. I'm like picturing doing a snippet on Instagram, like an audiogram. I remember quoting Nietzsche to my priest. I just love that. I love that.
Yeah, they started seeing me as the Antichrist when I was quite young, I would say. But that was a very interesting upbringing because I do come from a very small town in the middle of the Pre-Dolomites. And the geographical location itself, it was a valley, so there was only one way out. And being Italian, sometimes you just don't realize how much beauty you have around you, and you just give it for granted. And so I've always wanted to study arts. My parents, they were not that inclined to it. They were always saying, oh, you need to start maths, oh, you need to start business. And so that has always been a constant in my life. So I studied, for example, when I was in high school, they wanted me to study math, which I hated. I had dyscalculia, and I only found it later, that I have ADHD, and that's why, I just cannot do simple math. But I'm very good, for example, with spatial and with abstract thinking. So for me, art was always, the way in which I had to go back. And there was a lot also about science and math that, in a way, created the way I was thinking and approaching life. And very fast to the university years, I want to study art and business. My father who I deeply loved, he suggested, no, you should actually just study business. So I did 1 year of business. It was hell. I just found, it was so boring to do accountability studies, math analysis 1. So once I passed this very difficult exam on which actually was analysis 1. I said, you know what, I'm going to switch. I'm going to actually devote myself to art history. And so I basically studied art history, I think, for 6 years. Yes, I did a bachelor in art history. I did a master in Italy, so 2 years, and then another 1 year in curatorial studies at the Courtauld.
And wow, so do you have a double master's?
Yes, I did have a double master. And I even consider about going into PhD, because that's one of the things that you will do when start, working in the arts. You always feel that it's never enough. And that was very much my case, where it was never enough. I had top grades, that I was so much, very much into studying art history, which I think, was the perfect foundation, because then, which is something that we'll maybe discuss a little bit later, but it's about, you need to have the base. And I think that's one of my core foundation. Like, I know art history, I really study it. And the thing, though, was that as much as I loved studying, at the same time, I really needed to work. And so I remember I applied for this internship at Sotheby's in Milan while I was still during my undergraduates. And that was the first job that I've ever had in the arts. And it was like a baptism of fire, because I've never worked before. And I got to work in the press department. So I was actually the intern, but I was the assistant to the director. And we were liaising all of the communications internationally, talking about our auction programs as well. And after that, yes, it was studying and working. I then went to the Peggy Guggenheim collection. I started as an intern, and then again, I got offered a job into the educational program. And after as well, I had, I think, one of the most crucial moments in my career, let's say. I started working for this amazing gallerist and dealer in Milan, Via Roma, who actually she defined Arte Povera. The husband, Marcello Germano-Celent, they have these incredible exhibitions on Arte Povera. And Lia, she's been such a wonderful mentor to me, because, she saw the potential, and she very much, said, okay, now you do it straight. So a month into my internship, I started traveling with her. I was going to art fairs. I was going to New York. That was learning by doing. I had certainly no experience. I have a very strong art historical background, but it's not that I felt I had, the know-how or the knowledge. I had to learn by doing it. And it was something that Leah was always saying, which really stuck with me, which is, she was not worrying about things. She was taking care of things. So every time you will tell her, oh, don't worry about things, no, she would say, no, this is my job. I'm taking care of things. And seeing such an incredible woman still running her own gallery and working with incredible artists, and very much, being behind the scene and building their career. And we're talking of artists such as Amsa Kiefer, William Kendridge, Marina Abramovich, Joseph Kossuth, is like very long list. She was there. And she was living with them, she was creating their career. That for me, was just incredible. And then I really wanted to go into the Courtauld. I always thought, that was, a very good art historian. We'll have to go to the Courtauld. Otherwise, you're nothing. But, that's one of the things is like, I never felt that I was enough, which is crazy. Like, I think, Italians, they do have a little bit of that.
Oh, not just Italians. I
don't know what it is, but it's the industry. I don't know.
It's difficult because I don't have experience in any other industry, but I feel like it is incredibly prevalent in our industry that we always feel like there's more to be done. But it also, I think, is a personality trait of people who, I think, if looking at both of us, we both feel the same way, but also having this like entrepreneurial itch and this feeling of wanting to do more and bigger and grow and all of that. I think that is just part of how we function to a certain extent. Like there's always this feeling of never enough, or it could be more, which is also not a good mindset to have. Like there does need to be a shift in how we approach things to do it in a healthier way,
Absolutely. And the other thing is also about privilege. I was not coming from a family that was working in the arts. So I remember the first time, I started working at Sotheby's, it was made very clear to me that I was coming from a public university. It was not coming from a private one. And that was the first time they would ever have, a student coming from a public university. And so somehow I always had felt that I had to kind of explain myself, why I was working in the arts, and I think there's a lot of that, of privilege, that comes in, which doesn't necessarily, is connected to wealth. It's just about, do you have the rights, to be working here? And I think, that's one of the biggest issues in our industry so far. Is like, the fact that you would always, check if somebody has the right credentials, the right things to be working, to be given even the opportunity. Also because, I always felt in a way that I was not belonging. So I discovered, later on that I had ADHD, but it was something, for me that I was struggling, and it was just a matter of poor design.
And you didn't know that at the time either.
I didn't know.
Right.
And so for me, like, just sitting on a desk and doing my homework, it was terrible because I'm a creative person. I need to move. And that's exactly how I think.
Your brain functions differently to other people's. I think our school system or university system worldwide, I mean, I can't say worldwide because I've only had experience in the West, so Europe and the United States, but it's incredibly designed for neurotypical young people.
Yeah. If you think about even like, the Montessori method, which, child, would have, which is you need to learn by doing. And that's how, you find the best solutions. And that I think has always been a constant. So for me, to go through challenges, let's say, through early years, I always had to find a way that worked for myself. And yeah, when I was a quartal, then I started working in museums. The big moment I think came, yes, I was just, looking for a job after I graduated. I was curatorial assistant at Somerset House, and I was going through exactly the moment of relentless research on Google. I say, I need a job. What is it that I can get? And there's a terrible state in which you start sending out applications that already, but it's not the right fit for you. But you need to get a job, right? You don't want to prove to your parents that maybe they were right. You should have never gone into arts in the first place. And it was just a pure coincidence. I happened to go to a private opening through a friend of mine that happened to do actually a very similar job of what I eventually had started to do with Nicoletta. I went there, they were showcasing the private collection. I went straight to the director of the time, Mileva, and I said, oh, do you need an assistant curator? And it was just pure luck that at that point, the two former assistant curators were just leaving for other jobs. So actually they needed somebody. And so on the same night, I had an interview with Nicoletta. It was very, very surreal. And it was, her house, incredible art collection. It was just very weird.
Did you say it was the same night?
It was everything. It was the same night.
So you didn't even prep for an there was no you just rocked up and you're like, do y'all need an assistant curator?
Yes. It was like, if you're desperate, you go for desperate measures.
I love how you're like, it was really lucky, but actually you had the biggest, I can't say the biggest balls. You had such bravery in going up to someone at an opening and being like, do you need someone? I'm willing.
Yeah, asking
that's so
people,
brave.
What is it that you need? But for me, it has always been, the bottom line. I was never being put in a place of things to come to me. I always have to go out. That's why I was saying, for me, it's also like a geographical kind of stereotype. I used to live in a valley. I need to go out. There's one direction. I'm not waiting. I can't. I cannot afford that. So I need to go and hunt for myself. So that was very much it. And it was incredible. And it was a fantastic experience, which really, really defined me, because then I started working for the former company of Nicoletta, which was the Fiorucci Art Trust, which is an incredible, let's say, incubator for performative art. And Milovan, that year, it was 2019, he just came out after a very successful Italian pavilion at the Biennale. And so literally, I was working with one of the top curators at that time, and I was surrounded by artists. So, out of me knowing who they were, all of a sudden, you would get, I don't know, Harem Mirza, coming in, say, I have a work, to deliver to Nicoletta. I'd say, wow.
You're like, hello, I'll take that work.
So it's very much, I was very humble, didn't have much experience, but I have to dive in onto everything. And through that, I learned what I was not taught or told. through the traditional, let's say, art history background or in universities, which is like very so much. And I think, me coming out of a Courtauld, I loved, studying there, but it was very much about, well, you need to understand the scene. There's all of these amazing artist studios, all of these institutions. And through that job, working directly with the artist, understanding their vision, I was able to very much understand what is it, what we were doing and the complexity also of the industry.
Yeah. And how has that experience that you gained in the past, how does that affect how you do business now?
I think it's everything. Do you know why? Because in a way, I was not having the traditional CV, which goes back, then to the problem saying you're looking for a job. Because, I did museums, I did sales through a gallery, I did private foundations, and I also worked, directly with the artist. So I saw everything. And for me, it was very much coming from a place of being incredibly curious. Like, as we were saying, nothing was enough, for me. And I really needed to know. So one of the things is like, I can't just stay, with one thing. That's why I knew I couldn't do a PhD because I couldn't. And I didn't want it to become an expert only on one thing. For me, it was like very much about understanding the momentum, what is it that it is needed now. So that was a constant for me, I would say. The benefit was, that I was sitting very early on a different side of a table. And when you understand, different visions, you understand, how to potentially, bring all of those visions together. And that for me was key. Just understanding, that my unique selling point is very much I have a capacity. Probably also, I don't know, is it ADHD? Is it just how I'm wired? I don't know, but I'm a very good strategist. And so I always come from an understanding of saying, what is it that we can do with what we have available? I'm always very much against the idea that you need to create more, especially when resources are scarce. And that's something, that we see a lot in the art industry. And me coming from a place of saying, I need to create something with what is available, how we can create a business strategy that makes sense, that it can empower everybody. I think, for me, that was key because I saw those issues, very early on, and I was into the issues as well to make sense of those.
Yeah. I feel like listeners now are probably itching to know more about Studio Expanded. So moving on to speak a little bit more about that, already in the name, we get a feel for the artist and their studio being center stage. So what made you want to develop a company which is still quite new, having launched in October 2024, that manages artists instead of, say, why did you do that instead of starting your own art gallery or your own foundation or something like that?
It was a matter of necessity, again, and about valuable resources. So what happened when I was, at the Nicoletta Fiorucci Foundation was that literally, during the pandemic, we decided to close the Fiorucci Art Trust because, I think it was what was going on for everybody. They have to rethink the structures and to create something that made sense for her at that point of her life. And so then I was basically invested of saying, okay, close a company, have to open a new one and have to understand, from scratch, where do we want to go? And something that feels comfortable, like, as a costume-made dress on her to feel this is my new legacy, this is my new company. And it was very, very interesting because, I came in also almost like a crisis manager. I had to understand, okay, this is, a very emotionally charged situation, and we need to switch, from one identity to a new one. I learned a lot because, through that path, it was very much, me having to become a foundation director, having to set up a company, having to run everything, that you have to do with a company and using the resources, again, that were available to us. And so we knew that we wanted to focus on the legacy of the collection, the philanthropic side, and our fantastic relationship with museums and supporting the artists. So it was very much becoming, let's say, an incubator. And also the fact that Nicoletta herself always loved this idea of a home, of a domesticity in a way where people come in to live together. So we came out with this idea of, an archipelago of homes for artistic experimentation. But even the word foundation was terrible, for us to find, which is, now it's very upfront. but she hated it because it reminded her of a mausoleum. And I was saying, no, the foundation is the core of a house. You need to have a foundation in order to build the structure. And, that stayed with her. And what I realized then, I always knew, that I was working with a coach back then, Ariane Coic. She was the one that is founded the program of the arts at CERN in Geneva. And I knew that I wanted to transition this phase, the ex-Fiorucci Trust, to a new foundation. But then, I already knew that my time, was what I wanted to work on. And then for me to understand what was next for me. And I was very young. I was 27 when I became a director. And then
I love to hear like I was very young and I'm sitting here at 28 and I'm like, I have no idea what I'm doing.
I think, you're still 20, young. Like the problem was like I had no experience. That's why.
Yeah. No, I get it. 27 to be a director is like wild.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think, you're too young. I don't know. Still, I think, it's an Italian thing. Like, until you're 40, you're still young. But it's like, okay, you're literally, have to figure it out, all of this yourself. But what I learned, it was that, I was working on wealth management. That's exactly, what I was doing. I was building a foundation for the legacy of a collector, Nicoletta, making sure that everything was aligned. And it was, we were trying, to bring more value into the collection. So, 3 years in, I got pregnant and I was going to have a baby. So I knew that my life at that point had to change. And that's when, I think when my daughter was born, it was very much the moment of realization for saying, it was amazing until this point. I learned so much and I'm super grateful. But now I have somebody else, to take care of because, opening a foundation myself, it was like very much I was the surrogate mother, but it was not my child, right? And I had somebody else at that point. And I remember, the day that my water broke, I was on the tube and I had to text the team and say, I'm not going to be able, to make it to the, for the video call. I'm literally in labor.
Oh my gosh. But imagine sending that text message like, hey team, I'm not coming in today.
Yeah.
I can try to hop on the call in between contractions.
Yeah. But that's the thing. And it's all about life, isn't it? The moment I gave birth to my daughter, like I really didn't want, to resign, to get into maternity. When I held my daughter, it was like, I was born myself, through the process. And I realized, okay, there's so many things, that maybe don't make sense, for my life now. I need to create something that makes sense. And that was very much, the core foundation for Studio Expanded. Like, I was not sure that I wanted to come back into the arts, if I have to be very honest.
Really? So
yeah.
Was this after you came back from maternity leave? So you had your daughter.
During my maternity leave.
It was during your maternity leave that you then decided, okay, I think I'm not going to go back to the foundation.
Yeah.
And I'm going to start my own business. As a new mother, I'm going to start a startup.
Exactly. I know it sounds crazy. Girls, exactly. The process.
Like, yeah. Okay, wow.
Exactly. But it was coming from a place of necessity. I knew that I couldn't sustain, the amount of work and availability that I was requested before because I had a child. And so my life had to change.
And it's not like, with a startup, if I may. I mean, I'm just kind of making an assumption here, but looking at all the work that you do and all of that, it seems as though it's not necessarily like you're doing less work, but it's fully your time that you get to allocate when it's appropriate for you. And I think as a new parent, not that I would know, but I am guessing that as a new parent, that flexibility is the most valuable thing that you can have.
It's key.
Yeah.
But frankly, back then, I was looking and saying, well, do you know what? Maybe I should apply work as an art advisor in one of the big banks. I should go work in Morgan Stanley, if it's something that I know how to do. But again, there was a problem with saying, okay, I need to get a job. And because, I had such a varied experience, it was also like challenging for me to find the right job. And still, there's hours, like those are the hours you need to work. And what if the child gets sick? So it was very much, the artists that I used to work with before the foundation and then came to me and say, why don't you open your own gallery and you start representing me? Why don't you help me with this, like for a project? And I was very much doing it just out of love because I love them. We were friends.
So you were like advising artists.
I was advising them, but it was very much, my free time. I was nursing and chatting with my friends on the other side of the world, say, we're going to do this amazing exhibition. What do you think, I should be doing? How do you think, I should be negotiating on the contract? Literally, this kind of thing. So it was more of an entertainment during my maternity leave. But then, the idea started to set when I realized that it was very difficult for me, to just, get another job straight after maternity. Because people, of course, somebody will question that, do you have a child? It still happens, right?
I bet your husband doesn't get those questions.
Of course, no. Yeah. But,
boo.
Yeah. But do you know why? Again, I think like all of the challenges, and I think, we don't talk enough about failures, I think, in the arts. But failures, and complications and challenges are exactly, where you can find growth. And I've learned that every time, the path was not straightforward. I will always, come maybe, to my set goal, but maybe I had to learn something else in the process. And that was very much, studio expanded. I had to literally understand, can I afford to open a gallery? No. I started, looking into the business of an art gallery.
So was that your like first thing? Like your first point of call was like, oh, I want to potentially open an art gallery.
I was very much, keen into the idea. I loved, the fact, of working with artists and to let their career grow.
Yeah. Curate exhibitions. I mean, you started as an assistant curator.
Exactly that. But then I was like, oh my gosh, I was, running through business plans to say, this is a terrible model. And I'm sorry.
I think a lot of people would agree with you that the gallery model is one that needs a little bit of reinvention.
Yeah, but it needs also to be praised. Do you know what? Like, for those people that get into becoming a gallerist, honestly, kudos to you, because that means that you're very much setting your vision into that.
Yeah, the ones that are able to, I think in London, it's also a little bit different because the overhead costs of having a space are next level. Whereas if you do it in a different country where maybe the rent costs wouldn't be as high, or the costs to put on, utilities, even all of that, lights, heat, shipping, it really depends. I think, maybe the UK is actually
but
not
also
that
the
bad.
Commitment, because when I was thinking about opening a gallery, I was back then, I was in Budapest, we were taking the summer off to my partner's home country. So I was there and said, this is such an amazing scene. I would love to do something here. So I was sending, photos of this space, that I found very virtuous, to the artists, that I was, my friends in touch with, and I say, we should do something here. So that was my vision. I was really, considering that. But then I was like, oh my gosh, I still have a child. How can I travel, for fairs? And of course, if you become a gallerist, it's required of you, of course, to have the level of constantly being out, to seek, for example, for new clients,
it's business getting.
It's business, right? And so all of these things, they were coming as, I can't do that. I can't do that. I don't think, it either feels natural or authentic to me. I'm very much of a functional introvert, I would say, I'm somebody that needs time.
I don't believe that for a second.
I know.
A functional introvert, excuse me.
Yeah. Because, that's the thing, I do fluctuate between, being like, very good social butterfly. But then, at the same time, I need to have my space to think.
Every time that you and I mean, it's not like we've met 1,000 times, but like every time you have come across as not at all introverted, like in the way that you speak and go about, even like from the first second onwards of greeting someone. But maybe I'm making you bad assumptions about introverts, but typically like social situations. I've also never seen you in a social situation with a lot of people. It's always just been one-on-one, which I think is also different, isn't it?
Exactly. It's exactly that. I like, meaningful conversations. So if I need, to spend my time in a specific way, I want that to be a meaningful conversation.
Yeah. Which is what we've had.
Exactly. Right. Because, then it goes about, the questions of time, which eventually led to the available resources.
Yeah.
And so for me, it was like literally having to sit down and saying like, okay, this is not working. This is not working. What is it that we could be doing? And the interesting thing is that, again, it was a leap of faith. The last exhibition that I had at the Nicoletta Fiorucci Foundation, it was with this incredible artist, Himali Singh Soin. She won Frieze in 2019. And back then, she was looking for a custodian, let's say, to host this huge, like, sculptural marble, 150 kilos, for which, she won the Herrio Prize. And it needed to be shipped in the UK, and she needed a place to go. I said, well, do you know what? It could come, to the foundation, and how about, you create an exhibition through a selections of the works that we have in the collection responding to your work. And it was an incredible, exercise. So we had, for example, this beautiful sculpture by Himali and Carla Cardi that she chose in conversation. And to Himali, I remember, I came back to London. It was around November then. Yeah, 2023? Yes. And I said, do you know what? Let's do an exhibition. And it was very much because I knew that she was a very strong institutional artist with an incredible reputation. But I wanted to show to people that there's so much more than meets the eye to her practice. Because everybody will think about her as a performer or a video maker. But then because I had access to the studio, I knew there was more. I knew there were ceramics. I knew there were tapestries. So for me, it was almost like, a challenge to say, I want to open the studio. Let's do an exhibition together. And so the last exhibition that I had of, the foundation, that was actually the launching exhibition in October 2024, 5 years after she won Frieze, and was the right choice. An institutional artist, incredibly well placed. We did amazing partnerships of the same week that we had, for example, with Delphina Foundation and Arsenal Avenue. And tomorrow, and I mean, depending on when people, will hear this.
Yeah, unfortunately not tomorrow, lovely listeners. That was a few months ago.
Exactly. So, referring to that, tomorrow in sense of February 19, she's going to be opening with her partner as part of their group, Heilezoek Desires, an incredible, the Courtyard Commission, a Somerset House. And at the same time, next week, also Tate Britain Art Now. So that's exactly how it started.
And was that something that you facilitated now with that? Like, have you been working with the artist to facilitate these projects?
Yeah, the crazy thing is that I was very much early on there. And sometimes I even knew before her if something was confirmed. So that was, quite an interesting thing for me to be in. But then what I realized was, yeah, I like doing sales, but there is something that is missing and I cannot understand. And it's like, how do you create value in an artist? So I was always, constantly going back into that problem. How can you guarantee that an artist is a good investment, right? Is one of the most difficult things is about creating value for art. It's considered an asset in terms of an investment perspective, but is a very high risk one because nobody understands how the markets work. And so that for me, was very much always, necessity to say, I want to create and diversify the careers of these artists in a way that feels sustainable. I don't want them to go into overproduction. I don't want them, to feel that they can't realize something because they don't have a budget and to operate from a scarcity mindset. And that's how, Studio Expanded, then was born, and something that has been evolving ever since. Was like, okay, how can we create a system that makes sense for all the players involved? And that means the buyers, the galleries, the institutions, and ultimately the artist, in a way that is a very circular and lean system where everything in a way is a sort of an enclosed lab. Everything is monitored, but everything is built in a way to create growth for everybody.
Yeah. And I want to ask you more about how Studio Expanded fits into the art ecosystem, also like on a practical level and what that means. But first, I want to ask you, how do you choose the artists that you work with now?
Interesting question. I think until this point, they always came to me. So it was like, do you know what? It's like, when you fall in love with somebody, like you both have to like each other. Isn't it?
Well, yeah.
Kind of like that. You kind of have to like each other.
It's like a relationship.
It's a relationship. And I think very much is a long-term relationship. So I always, start with that. And I think, through my work, especially with Nicoletta, I had a great ability. I developed actually a great ability because, this is like skills that you get. It's not something that you're born with, right? To understand who's the next hit. And so, I would always, being scouting, for the next hit, so I would go, to the studio visits, to get works, for Nicoletta. So that's very much what I was doing.
So did you develop that eye by looking at art?
And studying art.
And right? Studying art. So it was your educational background plus the efforts that you went through in going to studio visits, seeing the art, interacting with the artists in order to develop that sort of feeling to find the next big
and
thing.
Having also, I would say, a nightbird view on things. Dyslexia. Yeah, it's not only about, I love that, an nightbird view. It's about, you need to understand the context. Like, nothing works in a singularity. There's geopolitical implications as well, right? It's economics. So you need to understand where an artist is placed within a specific, let's say, location, a specific hub. What are the trend? Let's say, when you have the people moment, with the auction and NFTs and everything that came out of that.
Yeah.
You need to understand, where is the world currently going? And I think, that is always something, very interesting to look at. You need to be in the moment, to understand if it's something that's going to work out or not. And investments, for example, they work exactly in the same way. There's things that you feel that there's still always risk, but you feel, this has, good potential because everything is lined up in a specific situation. That is something that for artists is not done. And that's what eventually I really wanted to do, is to create, the structure, the foundation, and the long-term goal to say, I know that what I'm providing is substantial and it's secure, if it makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And so once you decide that you're going to work with an artist, do you then develop a strategy with them? And what does something like that usually look like, just to give listeners a bit of a better idea?
I call it the due diligence phase.
The due diligence phase is like, what is she can talk? That definitely sounds like, whenever I say due diligence to like any collectors or something like that, it's like,
what? Yeah, they're like, what is she even talking about? But it's very much research. And it goes back again, artistry. You need to understand everything from the artist. I want to have an overview over everything, over the accounts, their connections, how much, their works, were sold before, what is the inventory, the connections, the calendar, the long-term goal that they might have, because that's how, you build value for the artist. And due diligence, to give, an explanation is like, for example, if you have a company, the company needs to, is like to be acquired, right? An investor will require a due diligence. Like, they want to understand, is my investment worth it or no, right? It's basically doing
deeper research on what you're currently investing in.
Exactly. Yeah. And to create like the structure for that to be very streamlined. So let's say very simple, basic management thing of you need to have an inventory. Otherwise, if you don't have an inventory, you don't have a track history, how can you even present it, to a gallery for representation? Like, people need securities. And so that's what, I almost like, force everybody, to work with me to do. We need to build security to provide, value with what you're giving.
So you deeply get to know your artist's market, your artist's practice, in order to be able to then look at, and again, we'll get onto this question about where Studio Expanded fits within the ecosystem and who you then work with outside of the artists, but you then build a really holistic overview of them as artists so that you can then go to these different other partners or other collaborators with that information and that as like a backing. You're like, this is the reason. Not just because the work is good, but here's all this other stuff. Here are these connections, here are the accounts, here's how it's grown in the last few years. Maybe here's the projected growth, that sort of thing. So you really develop a strategy.
Yes, exactly. Because it's about partnerships.
Yeah.
That's something that for me, it's such a crucial thing on everything that we do at Studio is partnership. And that's why it's about growing the pie. And I know, we're talking, we're using a lot of, business terminology, but just to give one,
USP, due diligence.
Well, do you know what? Like, I was saying, I don't come, from that background,
very you did do a year.
Yeah, I did do a year. Like, it was very passive learning, but it's, again, I'm a very curious person. So when I had to become, the director of foundation, having to work, through the accounts, I was working with legal, I was working with the accountant, I was doing the job, for me to understand how does this even work.
Of course.
In wealth management, actually, I was working with, on the investment side of things. So most of the time I was also, overseeing investments, and I had, to learn that. So that's what, kind of, came to be, me now talking with very strong business terminology. And plus, yeah, I was reading, all of those business books, to train literally, myself, right?
Yeah, no, I get
where the growing the pie actually comes from.
Really? From a business book?
Yes, it's actually a book by Alex Edmonds.
Oh my God, okay, so for listeners who can't see this, we have 2 books here on the table, and one of them, literally, the title is, one of them is Give and Take by, is it Adam Grant?
Yeah. By helping others drives our success.
Okay, and then we have Grow the Pie by Alex Edmonds.
Yes, who is a professor at London Business School.
I love how you brought those for I love this
for reference. Yeah, but I had a subscription, on Harvard Business Review, and that was, my podcast every day going to work at the foundation. So I was learning, right?
Wow. Okay. So I actually think that that's you've just planted a little seed in my head, because I love to listen to things and grow my knowledge while I'm doing other things like going for a walk or working out or something like that. And I find it so interesting because sometimes we get into our little art world bubble. But when I've expanded my listening and done other things, like one of my favorite books is by Guy Raz, and it's called How I Built This. And it's based off his podcast where he interviews entrepreneurs who have built really successful businesses. None of them have been art businesses. So I look at, all of the people that he's interviewed and everything, and I've soaked up all of what it means to bootstrap, what it means to go into a funding round, what it means to do all of that. And it's so valuable to know, because in the arts, sometimes I think the sector, I really love to encourage innovation and, well, maybe not innovation, but in a sense, almost adaptation of maybe thinking about businesses that we see in other sectors, how they can maybe be brought into the arts, how the arts can expand, how the studio can expand.
Yeah.
Haha. And I just think it's really amazing when someone brings in that business acumen, or in some cases like tech acumen or something else, where you are contributing to the sector with new perspectives. And so I'm like, okay, now I need to sign up to the Harvard Business. What was it? Harvard Business Review?
Harvard Business Review.
There we go. All right. That's on my to-do list now.
But you know why? Because again, my partner he's still working in finance. So a lot of our friends, will be working in finance and banks. And I'm always, the entertaining one, because I come from the arts. So I have all of, these crazy stories. But then you're like, oh my gosh, they earn so much in the arts, you're paid peanuts. Did I actually choose the wrong career? But by me listening to how their businesses works, it's such a valuable knowledge that you get. And again, talking about investments, I think it was Warren Buffett saying that his business partner, one of his biggest capacity is to understand on the spot if an investment is right or is wrong. But it's based on patterns. So I do actually believe, that nothing is created, nothing is new. It's just a reinvention. It's a constant wheel. And, in the arts, we kind of preach and we feel that we are unique. But, the rest of the world, they have structures and they work. So to understand how another business industry are implementing things, what is their business structure? How are they driving revenues? What is the legal framework? For me, it was I'm eager to understand, because I know that this, as it is not working. That's why I was saying I cannot open a gallery. It doesn't make sense for me. And so I needed, to get all of this information and to say what I can do with this, right? So the necessity, the scarcity, and scarcity, can also drive creativity. And creativity is crucial in every industry, because if you have creativity, then you find solutions. That's honestly what it was about, learning from other businesses that it can be integrated on how can you generate value on something, which, by the way, in the arts is an alchemical process. Giving value to something that doesn't exist. Who's telling you that why Warhol is so expensive, compared to something else?
It's quite an emotional thing, right? Yeah.
Because it's spiritual. It's you're creating a religion in a way. You want people to believe in something bigger than themselves.
That's a really interesting comparison. You're creating a religion in a way. I feel like I could do a whole entire podcast episode on just that, in terms of belief systems and the strength that stands behind a certain belief of market value, for example.
Oh, at the beginning, I was saying, for me, it was my religion, because, that's the law that I had for the art is exactly that. I have this sort of devotions, towards them. I had to learn also, how to manage my devotion, which is an element of giving If you become a business, then you need to find the right parameters, for, it's not just devotions, you need to create a structure, for that to work. It was a very interesting process, because, you have to love the artist, to do what I do. That's, I think, it's
back to that whole relationship comparison as well. It is a relationship.
Yeah, it is a relationship.
I mean, I hear this quite often. When I had Millie Jason Foster on the podcast, who runs Jillian Jason Gallery, one of her best examples of working with an artist is it's a relationship that you have with your gallerist. And I think that we keep returning back to that. It definitely is. And I think I'm often searching, kind of digressing a little bit, but I'm often exploring the topic of what it means to have your personal and professional intertwined so much. Because when you really love art, it moves you. I go to the National Gallery and I cry when I see Samson and Delilah by Peter Paul Rubens. I get emotional and I feel moved when I go into an artist studio and I see their work and I'm like, wow. And I want this around me. And I want this around me in my bedroom when I go to bed, or when I get up and have my coffee on the couch, or all of these things, right? It seeps into our personal life every day. Collecting art when you have it in your home is inherently personal because it's in your living space. Going to PVs in the evening and drinking with people and having conversations about the gripes that we have with the art world, personal as well. It seeps into one another. And so, as I said, I'm digressing a bit, but thinking about that relationship aspect and love is quite a strong thing that we have in the sector that I don't think a finance person, I don't know, maybe your husband would attest to it in a different way, but thinking about the love of art. For example, my mother is a lawyer, and I was thinking about going into law when I was younger. And my mom said I'd be a great lawyer, cool. But when I told her I wanted to study art history and I feel like I found something I love, she was the exact opposite to your parents. She was like, honey, go for it. If you love it, you're going to be able to make your way in that sector no matter what. I don't think you're going to love law. I don't think you're going to really burn for it. And I'm like, good shout. I wouldn't have sat and been like, oh, this gives me such, it makes my heart beat faster when something happens in the art world sometimes, when I do certain things, when I have the privilege of being in a gallery and I'm like, wow, this is wow. And that makes my heart beat faster, even 8 years down the line. Anyway, now I've completely digressed.
No,
returning back to that relationship.
You know why? Because in a way, that was also my parents' concern. They're my biggest cheerleaders. I wouldn't have been able to be here if it wouldn't have been for them to allow me to go through the path. But I think they were concerned about the struggles and the emotional part of it is so much part of his job. It's not about even finances. It's not about, you completely lose, your attachment to money when you work in the arts. It's kind of not a requirement.
I know, but
which is unhealthy.
It is unhealthy because it's like, oof, now I'm struggling.
And that, I think, it's actually the problem, because as we were saying, there's an element of devotions, towards the art, because it's something that is bigger than us. It moves us. It's so powerful when you connect to that, right? And even being close to somebody that is creating, if you think about that, it's an act of creation. It's like you're being close to God somehow, right? You can be an atheist, but still, or agnostic, but still you're believing in something, right? And being close to art is what, I always feel is the closest proximity that I have to something that is bigger. And you have that, in terms of art, but I mean beauty, nature itself. It's something that you can't really grasp. And that itself is almost like a problem within the industry, because it removes the financial element of talking about money, which is something that is necessary for everybody. We all need to get a salary to support ourselves, right? And it's something that is so weird. In the arts, it doesn't feel like nobody wants to talk about art. Sorry.
No, everyone wants to talk about art. Nobody wants to talk about money.
Right?
I knew what you were going to say. Yeah.
And it's so complicated. And that for me was where, having kind of, this very understanding of finance by proxy. That's where, I was going back. Is how is wealth generated? Why and how a company is evaluated more valuable than another? What is the trend? What are the political implications, the geopolitical implications? Why? You need to understand how money is made and how money is kept in order to understand what is it that we're even doing. And I think that is the biggest problem, in the arts. Nobody wants to talk about money, but it makes it very, very unhealthy. for everybody to
survive. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you said, like with Warren Buffett's business partner who looks at patterns in order to determine right off the bat if it's a good investment or not. You know, it takes a lot of training that eye in order to be able to develop that ability, right? And I feel like when you study art history in particular, at least it was my experience, that it was completely stigmatized to mix art and business. I had some roadblocks when I was president of the Art Business Society in the first year that it was running. There was a professor at the time at UCL who was like, this professor didn't know that I was the president for the next year. It was at the end of the previous year, and I was going to move into the presidency, so to speak, in my final year. And so it was my second year of my BA. And this professor was like, did you hear that they started an art business society? We've been trying to separate art history and art business for the last century. I don't understand. And I was just like, yeah, but that's not the reality. You're sending people into a sector to fail. You're sending people into a sector to not have any idea how to get a job, how to work. Yeah, sure, we can all sit around and have this utopic idea that art history can change how we view everything. Yeah, it does. I mean, consuming art does increase empathy. It's proven. It changes the way that we see the world, that we see, it changes the way that we approach everything. Also, especially for visual learners. But it's just not okay for education, for academia, to do exactly, what you were talking about, not providing at least a little bit of support to learn all of those really valuable things that you just spoke about. All of the recognizing what business actually means. And you looked at other sectors and you had exposure through your personal life, which is so valuable, and through growing the pie.
But it's so true because I was naive as well.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Which is very interesting. And I think, if people, would listen to this podcast, people that, know me very well, my family will start laughing. I'll say, her talking about business? Do you know why? Because, I had that very much, I was thinking exactly the same way. The art, it's something so bigger. It just have to exist. Don't ask me questions about finances. You just have to believe it.
I was the same, Valeria, really. I was the exact same. And now it's like,
reality.
I know how to read contracts. I know how to do accounting.
You have to start, learning negotiation. That's, things that they will teach you during an MBA course.
Yeah.
Nobody teaches you that at art history degree. But being a producer in the arts is one of the most important, valuable things because you need to produce something. You need to make the idea of the artist real. How do you do that? Where do you find the budget? Philanthropy itself, there's so many problems, right? Which I had to face, through my previous job. Philanthropic, work, it's difficult, especially now in the UK, but also in the rest of the world. Yes, which is one of the most interesting part. And it's all institutions, museums are struggling now in the UK, but worldwide, right? It all goes down back to money. If you don't have the money, you need to fundraise. And if you look even about the available jobs now, it feels like you need to become development. You need to start working in development, of museums because they require money. And development in museums is sales. There's no different, from you working and selling actually an artwork. And I keep saying this to people. It's even more complicated because you're not actually selling an object. You're not transferring a painting. You're selling an idea of saying, please support my institutions because I think we're going to be doing this amazing exhibition. I think, we're better than the other one. But in exchange of what? But it's because, the system is wired in a way for that not to be sustainable. So everybody, in the end, if you're always looking at the same thing, it's about money. How to generate money? How to make the system, affordable? And I think, this level of scarcity, especially for artists, it's such a difficult thing to navigate. And it's understandable. It's because, their art is an extension of himself, right? So it's like if you would have to ask somebody, give a value to your hand. How do you do that? It's very difficult.
Well, and the black market might not. I'm just kidding.
I know we say Korean is interesting study, which is also a lot related to art, right? The black market.
Yeah.
But anyway, and that's why, I was working a lot with institutional artists, which is such an interesting kind of artists. It's like, artists that are institutionally collected, institutionally supported.
It's different to commercial, for example.
But again, the distinction, commercial, institutional, what is it? Like, one needs the other to sustain itself. And I think, this is actually key. This is a problem. Like, and I had a lot of artists, saying, oh, I don't want to be commercial, but then I actually need the funds, to do the big museum installation. You're like, okay, but how are we going to be handling this? I can't just run after, collectors to say, please, I just need, this money, but what for? I don't know.
Yeah. And I mean, I was speaking to a curator in Vienna, and she was telling me about how part of her job as a curator is, you liaise with a lot of different parties when you're putting on contemporary art exhibitions within a museum. But part of that is also, for example, when an artist is both, having this institutional show, but also in the commercial market and represented by a gallery will often help fund the institutional exhibition.
It just makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Because you need to increase the value of the artist. How do you do that?
Institutional shows.
And that's where, I was going back to, in a way. Yeah.
Yeah. And in terms of that, art ecosystem, you state that, and I'm going to get my note up here to make sure that I explain it really correctly in that succinct way. Going back to thinking about how Studio Expanded fits within that art ecosystem, we're talking about institutions, galleries, artists. You state that Studio Expanded is a globally operating art, fintech, and artist management company, bridging the gap between art, investment, and philanthropic cultural impact. And it's redefining the art ecosystem in a way. So what way is it igniting the change? How is it different here?
I'm basically investing in artists and I'm creating their value. And it's what we were saying even with institutions. So for an artist to become a valuable asset, let's say, for their art to become valuable and interesting, even from a financial perspective, you need to create a system for which the artist gets the right gallery representation. There's multiple players that are interested in promoting their art. And that means, that you're looking at different markets. So a wider audience of potential buyers that would buy their work. That means that you need to strengthen the institutional path. Because again, think about investments. If I buy an artwork, necessarily I want, and this is something that the galleries, they try to do a lot of the hardest part ever, right? Is to get that artist, that name into an institution because that consolidates the value. So if something happens within the market, let's say secondary market, you do an auction and it probably is maybe too early and the work is sold, below a certain margin, that is going to depreciate the value of the artwork that it was offered by you in the first place for your gallery. So institutions is key because when an artist is in a museum, and let's say, maybe like a prestigious one, that at least they are art historically recorded. And then you need to think, of course, about who is buying the artwork. And all of this is a very strong circular model for which, I kept, going back as how do we do it? How we do it? And it's because, if you create, so we very much focus on the artist and the name it says it, right? Is Studio Expand. So in Latin, you would say it's nomen omen, like, the name, carries its own vision and its own meaning. Because for me, it was like the studio is the most valuable place and it's very difficult to get access to an artist studio. So you would be able to get an access to a studio only if, if you're a curator, a very prestigious collector. But you need to focus on the studio and then to expand it in a way that is sustainable. And so to understand what are the artworks, that are available. If you're making, for example, let's say a big project, a big productions, how can we use what is already available there and in a way to kind of, let's say, to lease it almost. Do you know what I mean? It's like, how can you create other revenue streams from what is already available in order for you to grow more sustainably and to maybe, get somebody else, to help you in the studio. That is the growth. It's not about thinking I need to produce more in order to get X. Because that is like, for me, it's a recipe for disaster. And I see that, many, many times, like big institutional show, the museum say, I have this budget. The artist coming back and saying, no, is 10 times more. And everybody, starts getting, oh my God, how do we do this? And nobody is able to say no to the artist. So my role is very much, up front to be that person that is doing the due diligence to say, does this work? Does this not work? What is another possible solution, for us to get to what you envision? And so it doesn't mean that we have to downscale. It's just like, I need to think of other revenue streams for that artist to be strong and to be reliable. Because then if I approach a gallery to say, I'm working with this incredible artist, I think, you should represent them. I have also a responsibility towards them and towards also, investors. Is like, why do they have to invest as well in growing this artist if I'm not sure as well that they are performing? And in terms of performing, it's not financial performing. I'm saying like that they are connected to their practice. So it's like you need to do the core things. Like, you need to set up yourself in a way to be solid and grounded and to be humble as well in order then to grow to wider success. And so, for example, like, when I have artists, that approach me and say, oh, I want to make sales, 100K by next month. I'm like, doesn't work that way. Because, we need to create a platform. We need to create partnerships. And for me, even to go reach out to museum curator, a gallerist, or to the investors, that we work with, I need to be certain that what I'm providing is valuable. So that's why I'm saying it's a relationship. It's like, I don't like, the word giving and take it, but it's about giving and receiving back. And if you have, this growth mindset, everything then works and works well.
Yeah.
But, it's everybody's reputation and everybody, commitment coming into place. So for that to work, you need to be aligned and you need to have partnerships. And that's why then it becomes a circular business model. So what we do is very much, and we call it's actually fintech in the sense that we use, for example, blockchain systems, to streamline everything. And it's a fintech in the sense, that there is investment, that are included in all of the different chains. So, for example, we start working with an artist, and then I say, okay, should we actually early invest in this artist, to boost their career? So that means, of course, from a financial, acquisition potential, but then, very much everything is targeted to say, let's grow the platform, let's grow the number of partners. And that is perceived in a great way, actually. I was very pleased to see that galleries don't see us as competitors, but actually as partners, because we are removing, let's say, the emotional part that actually makes things messy. It's transaction at the end of the day. It's business. And that's usually, the tricky part.
So that's where I kind of want to ask in terms of how do you have those relationships? Because you're not here saying, okay, this business model is replacing the gallery model. Instead, you're working with galleries and with it. I mean, it's, for me, looking from the outside looking in, I can see your business model and I can see how you make those connections with institutions. But then it's like almost seeing or getting more clarification on how you're actually doing a similar thing with the gallery too. You're not here replacing them as a player. Instead, you're adding another step that adds value to the entire ecosystem in a way, right? Am I describing that in a good?
How we work, that is exactly, the model.
Yeah.
Like, because, we come in a very, very early stage. It's like, we're the incubator for the artist and we're managing all those very critical aspects, to wire the system, right? But to do that, you need to have different alliances, different partnerships. So gallery and this are crucial.
Yeah.
Because if I don't have a gallery working with the artist.
Yeah. So it's like, it's just making it clear that you're not replacing a gallery. It's a very different approach.
Exactly. Especially because, do you know why? We don't do sales on our side. Like, we do private sales, but it's only with specific type of clients. And we're talking about corporate banks, investment funds. That's where I focus. Okay. So that's why, I'm not a competitor to the gallery, because the gallery has to work with the collectors, and making sure that the artist gets into the best art collections.
Right. And just one penultimate question before we kind of wrap up the episode, because I am looking at the time and I'm aware of it. How financially do you go about this with the artists?
It's very simple. We don't work as a traditional artist agency. I was very much against the idea of just taking a big percentage out of your annual revenues. And that's how, usually, it's structured. And for me, it was like, I want to open the services to everybody. So for example, we have different divisions, in Studio Expanded. And that's the other crazy thing. We started as artist management, but then it started growing, so fast. And then, there's the investment side, then there's private sales and institutional collaborations, right?
So it's more art management, not artist management.
It is artist management.
Artist management.
Yes. You all start from the artist. You need to do that because otherwise you don't have anything. Like, think in terms about what is the primary resource. If you don't have an artist, you don't have anything, right? I need to work very much of a preliminary stage about creating the art and what happens, and then I follow literally, the entire supply chain. That's exactly what Studio Expanded does. And that's why it's been wired in a way that is a circular business model. And so, for example, the artists, we have incredible, group of artist liaison that are trained as producers and curators and researchers. And they have this one-on-one, relationship with the artist and making sure that they are the person mediating with different partners and they can negotiate also on behalf of the artist, which is always, a great thing, to not be, you don't want to reveal too much of yourself, right? If you're an artist, you shouldn't be being the one, who has to tag, on contracts, how much you should be paying for. Somebody else has to vouch
having an advocate for you.
Yes, exactly. And that's exactly, for example, on the management side is exactly what happens. And so for that, we provide, different, let's say, tiers. So from a very basic one, which is like we give access to an inventory system and like very simple help for the artist to say, if you need to send, for example, a PDF presentation to a collector, to a gallery, you have it. It's just a matter of, 10 seconds, you have it. But that sometimes, takes a lot of time. So for me, it's very much of thinking about, okay, you need to streamline the process the most effective way for us, then to build everything else that gets on top. And just maybe, to clarify. So why, this is like a very modular system is like, there's, let's say, this amount of time that is dedicated from the artist liaison that is decided up front, right? But then, when the artist gets, for example, in big production or institutional shows, then the team will come together to say, okay, this is project. So that it's where, for example, we will try to account for that, not directly to the artist. And it's interesting, and that happens, keeps happening more and more and more. We have galleries that reaches out to us to say, I have this artist, it's one of the strongest one I have. They have this big project coming up. What do we do? And then we come in with a strategy, we plan it out in a way that then is financially valuable for everybody. And the artist feels supported, from A to Z. And for institutions as well, I think that's where we're focusing a lot on currently is, for example, when you have big campaigns, and I call them campaign, which is how can you raise funds for institutions? And the way we do it is like, okay, we create a strategy with the artist, with their gallery to say, this is the path. We want to raise X for the museum, how we can make it in a way that is good for everybody. And that's very much our job, is about creating strategies that are financially and culturally viable. Because at the end, everybody will win out of that.
And you have this tier system that you were talking about.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Right. Well, Valeria, I have one final question to actually round off the episode. And it's one that I like to ask all of my guests just to kind of have a nice end to the episode. It's a little bit of a fun one. If you could pick one artist from art history, who would it be and why?
I had such a difficult time trying to answer this question. I would just try to say Marcel Duchamp, because I think it's such an enigmatic personality. He was a polymath in a way. He created contemporary art. He created the value on something that's, it's the magic. That is the alchemical process. How do you give value to something that maybe, it's something else? And I always, find that so fascinating, and his connections also to science. And in a way, that's why, I think the role of artists is an incredible one, because somehow it feels like they have the ability to understand life in a different way. And when you look, for example, at the scientific developments, you look at artist, practices, the two things actually, move in a synchrony, which I always found, so fascinating. But it's because, somehow we are both feeling the zeitgeist. It's like there's something, when you are so into life and reality, and when you're so connected to it, you just understand when something is switching. And I think that's the ability that artists have.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that wonderful answer. And again, for coming on the podcast, for taking the time today, for sharing your expertise and telling us more about this really exciting business that you run.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
Absolutely. And that is it for today on All About Art. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave me a rating or a review, as it helps more people discover the show. Also, feel free to share with your friends, or if you share on social media, tag me and get in touch. Thank you so much for listening.